A new book by Bloomberg's Stephanie Baker, Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. I'm pleased to say that here in New York City, around the table with us, Stephanie Baker. Stephanie, good morning to you.
Morning.
Let's just start with how quickly this came together and how much work goes into a book and how much you did in about 18 months. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, I wanted to get it out before the election, but it's in a way a product of a lifetime of work. I lived in Russia in the 90s. I went back periodically to interview Russian billionaires over the years. But, you know, I wrote the book last year in about 6 months.
That is absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah.
Talk to us about what prompted it and how different things are post this war, during this war, compared to, say, the initial invasion into Crimea back in 2014.
Yeah, I really saw this as an end of an era. This unprecedented wave of sanctions against Russia, much different, much harder than the sanctions that were imposed after the annexation of Crimea in 2014. You had this, it was really the end of 30 years of integration of the Russian economy with the West. And there were just all these dramatic stories to tell. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been frozen. Major global corporations had to decide, do they stay in Russia? Do they leave, like McDonald's? Deliberations in Washington about how to limit Putin's revenues to undercut his ability to fund the war. So I try to tell the backstory behind all these dramatic decisions, flipping from policymakers in Washington, London, and Brussels to oligarchs with their assets frozen. It upended everything from European football to the global oil market. So, it's quite sweeping.
This had a lot to do with both private and public sector going after Russia. You mentioned McDonald's, Starbucks, Danone, each had very different ways of how they were going to slowly pull out. And then you had this unprecedented sanctions from the West. What do you think hurt the Kremlin the most? Was it the companies that all pulled out and changed course? Or was this level of sanctions, the freezing of assets, that hurt?
I think it was the freezing of Russia's central bank reserves that decision they took within days of the invasion, which was, historic, really. It had never been done before. They'd done it with Iran and Venezuela, but the amounts of money were relatively small. With Russia, it was $300 billion that was parked in Western financial institutions, mostly in Europe. That was something that Putin was not expecting. And now you have this big fight over, well, instead of just freezing the assets, can we actually seize them and use them for Ukraine? And that debate and that sort of back and forth is happening as we speak right now. They're talking about trying to use those assets to back up a $50 billion loan for Ukraine.
Right. And on the leadership level, they took that agreement at the G7, but it still feels like they're trying to work out actually how to do that. Does it change if we get Donald Trump in the presidency in January?
Right. Well, that's the million-dollar question. He has said, we have to go off what he said. He said that he will end the war in a day. He'll end it before he even enters the White House. He hasn't spelled out how he's going to do that. But if he's going to try to broker a ceasefire, it's hard to see how he could persuade Putin to stop fighting without some kind of sanctions relief. Putin is desperate for some kind of sanctions relief because there are a lot of loopholes in the sanctions, but they're still costing Russia hundreds of billions of dollars.
What was the most surprising detail from the book that you've uncovered?
Oh, that's a hard question.
It's like picking your favorite child. So pick your favorite child.
I think it was remarkable how the West came together in a coordinated fashion. You'd never seen that. Just, Europe, the UK, the US, and Japan acting in concert across a number of different decisions. And I think that was the most surprising thing in the sense that you'd never had that level of coordination before.
Did it feel fragile, or was it something that was sustainable regardless of what political cycle we're in?
I think there were always debates and fights and disagreements over things, and you're seeing that still playing out with this fight over Russia's central bank reserves, because so much of the reserves are parked in Europe. Europe is still divided. Europe is the one that's opposed to actually seizing the principal and using it for Ukraine. The U.S., Jake Sullivan and the Biden administration has finally come out in support of that. But there are still debates and divisions over, how to move forward.
Stephanie, you described this at the start of this conversation as an end of an era. And we reflected on what it felt like in 2014. Initially, after that invasion, I think there was always this feeling from corporate America and for European corporations as well. They might have to step back, but ultimately things will normalize again and they can go back in. Do you get the sense that people still believe there are certain companies a certain section of corporate America believe that that opportunity, that opening is just around the corner down the road, that they've moved on?
Yeah, that was the biggest mistake of Western corporations operating in Russia. They all thought it might blow over, and they'd spent decades building up, physical assets in Russia that they did not want to give up. I think a lot of them have finally realized this is not going to change. And you've seen, just recently, a major corporation, Unilever, finally deciding after 2.5 years that it was time to sell and get out. The problem is those that waited are paying a heavy price for getting out. They have to agree to a heavy discount. They have to pay 10% to the Russian budget. So it's the ones that got out early within the first couple of months, like McDonald's and a few others, that ended up looking smart.
Can I ask this question? And it's a difficult one to answer, so forgive me for asking it. Your experience with Russia, the lessons that we've learned, particularly for corporate America, hoping things would blow over and ultimately understanding that we're going to have to lose money. Is there anywhere else in the world we're making the same mistake at the moment?
Well, one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book was because I saw this as a grand experiment in economic warfare. We'd never impose sanctions on a country as big as Russia or as integrated in the global financial system, a major oil exporter. And, we're seeing that still playing out in the lessons learned. And obviously, the big lesson to be learned is how do you do this for China if China indeed invades Taiwan or imposes a blockade. And China, with roughly 1/3 of global manufacturing capacity, that poses huge challenges. And I think it would be very difficult to impose the kind of economic isolation on China that we've tried with Russia.